Ethan Carter hadn't seen his son in almost a year. College had changed Ben. He carried himself differently now, spoke less, kept his thoughts to himself. When he was younger, they had been inseparable. Now, Ethan barely recognized him. That's why this trip was so important. The cabin had belonged to Ethan's father, a man he barely knew. He had received the deed in the mail, along with a short and personal letter from a lawyer. His father had lived out his last years in solitude, buried in the Montana wilderness. Ethan hadn't spoke to him in decades, and now the old man was dead, leaving behind nothing but his crumbling structure in the woods. The place was exactly now how he remembered it from childhood visits. Silent, heavy, with the weight of years. The forest loomed thick and watchful, the trees pressing close as if they had been waiting for someone to return. The air carried the sharp scent of impending snow. Inside, dust lay thick on every surface. The fireplace was cold, and the only sound was wind slipping through the unseen cracks. Ethan set down their bags and stretched. "No service," Ben muttered, frowning at his phone. Ethan smirked. "Good. Means you actually have to talk to me." Ben rolled his eyes, but didn't argue. The first night, the wind picked up, a deep moaning sound that wrapped around the cabin. The fire crackled through jittering shadows against the wall. Ben sat in the old armchair, staring into the flames, lost in thought. "You ever talk to him?" he asked suddenly. Ethan knew who he meant. "No," he admitted, "not since I was a kid." "Well, why do you stay out here?" Ethan hesitated. "Some people, they just don't do well with others. He just wanted to be left alone." Ben nodded. His expression was distant. Outside, the wind carried a sound that made Ethan sit up. A faint crunch, like footsteps. Ben heard it too. He glanced towards the window, but the darkness beyond the glass was absolute. Ethan stood and moved to the door, pressing his ear against the old wood. Silence. Then, tap, tap, tap. A slow, deliberate sound against the porch railing. Ethan's breath hitched, probably a tree branch, but didn't look convinced. They stayed like that for a long moment, listening. The wind howled again, swallowing any other sound. Eventually, they forced themselves to relax. But neither of them slept well that night. By morning, a heavy snowfall had begun, fat flakes tumbling in slow, hypnotic spirals. The world beyond the porch was a shifting white blur. Ethan stepped outside to gather firewood and nearly slipped on something frozen in the snow. His breath caught tracks, not boot prints, not an animal's paw, something huge. Each print was nearly the size of his own foot, sunken deep in the snow as if something massive had walked through. The strangest part? The strides were impossibly long. Whatever had left these prints walked on two legs, but his gait was inhuman, stretching nearly twice the length of an average man's step. A chill crept through Ethan that had nothing to do with the wind. He turned, following the tracks with his eyes. They led into the trees, then just stopped, as if whatever made them had simply just vanished. He swallowed hard and turned back to the cabin. He wouldn't mention it to Ben. Not quite yet. By the time the sun set, the storm had thickened into a howling whiteout. Inside, the atmosphere had changed. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. The wind had shifted, carrying a new sound, one that didn't belong to the storm. A deep, rhythmic breathing. It came from the trees. Ben sat by the window, staring out into the dark. He hadn't spoken in over an hour. You okay?" Ethan asked. Ben didn't look away. "Something's out there." Ethan wanted to dismiss it, but the certainty in Ben's voice unsettled him. The wind screamed, rattling the cabin, but beneath it came another sound. Ethan froze. Ben stood up slowly, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" Ethan nodded. The growl came again, this time closer. then a loud thud against the porch. Ethan grabbed the fireplace poker, his pulse racing. He gestured for Ben to stay behind him as he crept towards the door. A shadow passed over the window. Large. Too large. Ethan's breath hitched for the first time in his life. He felt something he hadn't felt since childhood. Pure, unshakable fear. Then something dragged its claws along the cabin wall. The sound was long and deliberate, metal against wood, slow and patient. Ben backed away from the window. "Dad!" Ethan held up a hand, signaling him to stay quiet. Then the doorknob turned, slowly. The wind howled, the fire sputtered. The doorknob rattled harder. Ethan's grip tightened on the poker. "If someone's out there," he called, "you better speak now." Silence. Then a deep, rumbling exhale from the other side of the door. Ethan's stomach dropped. That was not a man. The thing outside let a low chuff, almost like a chuckle. Then it moved away. The footsteps, heavy, deliberate, circled the cabin. Snow crunched under its weight. It was pacing, watching, waiting. Ethan barely breathed. Then it climbed onto the roof. The ceiling groaned under its weight. Ben clamped a hand over his mouth, eyes wide. What felt like hours, they just listened. Then, just as suddenly as it come, the sound stopped. Silence. Morning came, gray and bleak. The blizzard had calmed, leaving a thick, eerie silence in its wake. A park ranger arrived, checking the cabins after the storm. He knocked on the door. There was no answer. Inside, the fireplace was cold, the chairs undisturbed, the beds still made. No sign of struggle, no sign of anyone, except for one thing. A single streak of blood, dark against the snow, leading from the front door out into the woods. The storm had erased the footprints, but something had been there, and it had taken them.